Hi, everybody. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and thank you for coming to my channel. Today, I'm going to discuss Susan Sontag's On Photography. And, you might be wondering, like, is he ever going to not like a book? Well, today is the day. I do not like this book. I do not recommend that you read it. Though I will recommend that you read the first essay in the book, so I will mostly focus on that. So, On Photography by Susan Sontag, this was published in 1977, but it's a collection of essays. So, the series of essays was published in the New York Review of Books between 1973 and 1977. So, part of the problem with this book is that it is a collection of essays, and so it becomes extremely repetitive. I mean, think about it. If you write each of these essays separately, then you do need to repeat yourself to some degree, because you can't assume that somebody's reading the current essay has read your previous essays, right? So that's completely normal, completely reasonable thing to do. If you constantly write for the New York Times, for instance, then you're going to have to repeat yourself from time to time because you can't assume people have read your previous articles. But when you put all those together in one book, it does not do your writing a service because now I'm reading it, all the articles one after another. And I have already heard this point several times. And I start to become frustrated with why you keep making the same point. Um, so, what is this about? It's entitled On Photography. There's two elements to this. There's her commenting on photography as a pure sort of art form and, critiquing artists that I must admit I was not necessarily aware of, and just critiquing, the museums and just art itself and photography. That aspect, I must admit, I learned some things about, and I'm not one to have much of an opinion on, worth listening to. But then the other aspect of her writing is just photography in everyday life, because photography, of course, um, maybe even more so than the other art forms, becomes a part of something that everybody does, right? It's especially in 2024, everybody's taking photos. That doesn't mean everybody's taking good photos, but everybody's taking photos. I'm notorious for taking not so good photos. But anyway, the point is just that it's everywhere. The proliferation of photographs is everywhere. Um, so I'll comment mostly on that, and she goes in and out of commenting on just photography in the fine arts realm, and then photography in the world at large. I would recommend that you just read the essay entitled "In Plato's Cave." In this book, it's the first essay. It's only 24 pages, so it's a quick read, and it's certainly worth reading to kind of just think about photography. What's interesting about this essay, reading it in 2024, knowing it was written in the 70s, is how at times it feels like she's writing about now, right? I mean, there's some giveaways sometimes where she talks about putting photographs into books. We don't really do that anymore. So we know, oh, okay, this can't be 2024 when you hear her say that. But a lot of what she's saying feels like a rant about 2024 and how photographs are taken now. At times, I can't help but feel like, man, what would Susan have to say if she was alive now? So Susan lived from 1933 to 2004, so she didn't really get to see, social media become what it is today and photographs become what they are today. I feel like if Susan was still around writing critiques of photography, she'd have a lot to say now. And I think part of what makes this writing, not so interesting to me, and maybe just not as interesting to the 2024 reader, is just that I just feel like we've become so aware of the issues with photography. If you're reading articles and you're keeping up with just like what's going on in the world, with social media and what people are saying is the effects of it, I just feel like we're just so aware of this issue, right? We know that when we see our friend's Instagram page, that we shouldn't take all these photos at face value. That just because it looks like they're having fun doesn't mean they actually had fun, right? And it doesn't mean it's a complete lie either, right? Or when we look at dating profiles, we know that it doesn't necessarily capture exactly who this person is, right? And some of these photographs may not be so accurate. Or we know that all photos are doctored and touched up. And we've had conversations about how this affects people's body images. And these are important points to make and important conversations to have, but I just feel like in 2024, going into 2025, like this is a conversation we're having on a regular, everyday basis, and we should be. But to read Susan talk about it, it just doesn't feel like she has the same depth of understanding or ability to really um, give us something new to think about a lot of times. It just doesn't feel like there's much here. Again, her writing is so repetitive. She constantly brings a thesis up in a paragraph, right? Which seems like a strong thesis. And then by the end of the paragraph, she moves on to another thesis. And it's like constantly these really pretty sentences that sound really deep, but they never get developed. It's like if I had a student submit writing to me like this, I'd say, just take one of these paragraphs and develop it into an essay. Give me some substance, give me an argument, and don't just keep moving on paragraph to paragraph to paragraph with more and more points that you never develop. It's just not good. It's just not good writing that has this sort of pseudo intellectual feel to it, that you are a very good writer, you're good at crafting sentences, but you don't have any substance behind those sentences. So you have to keep moving on from paragraph to paragraph onto something new because you don't have the ability to develop it into something deeper. I mean, I'm being very hard on her, but I can't help but feel that way. Um, and one thing I just want to point out in the second essay, she brings up this artist Diane Arbus, who I was not aware of. Those out there who are really into photography probably know who she is. I will link to some videos about her because I think this is a really interesting person just to kind of study and think about and look at her photographs. So I'll have you check that out. But to just talk a little bit about this particular essay in Plato's Cave, beware, it gives the impression that the essay is going to involve Plato in some way, but it really doesn't. If you get rid of the title and you get rid of the first sentence, so I'll read the first sentence. It's a nice, pretty sentence. Humankind lingers unregeneratively in Plato's cave, still reveling its age-old habit and mere images of the truth. Very pretty sentence. But if you get rid of that sentence and you get rid of the title, Plato never comes up again, and neither does any real substantive ideas about Plato come up. And though I will give her, she made the title correct in the sense she said in Plato's cave, because in Plato's cave is where we talk about the images being like a false sense of the truth, right? That when we take images, we're looking at these images on the walls of Plato's cave, we're seeing sort of the false sense of the truth. The reason why Plato is a weird person to bring up here, though, is because for Plato, even the real world around us is a false representation of the truth. And he's trying to get us to get out of Plato's cave so that we can see the true realm of the forms and things like this. For Susan, that's not the case. I mean, for her, photographs are a sort of cheap copy. It feels like. I mean, she never really makes a strong, definitive point, but I think in between the lines, for her, a photograph is somehow a cheap copy of the real thing. But for her, the real thing is the real world around us, and Plato would not necessarily agree with that, even though he does feel like taking copies of things is even more problematic because he wants you to get to like some higher truth. Um, in any case, so Plato really does not enter into this discussion, nor should it, for Susan. It's just a pretty, it's just like a pretty thing that she likes to put a bow on this essay and make it sound, deeper than it is. But it really, Plato's not going to enter into this in any reasonable sense. Let me get into some of the things, though, I think are interesting, though, and not just, it's funny. I'm critiquing a critique, right? Susan is critiquing photography here, and now I'm critiquing her writing on photography. I can't help myself. She talks about how photography is aggressive, that it oversimplifies things. And she also talks about how we assume a photo is closer to the real thing. We give it more credibility than it deserves. I think this is an important point to make. Again, so she could have fleshed it out more, but I think this is important that when we see a photograph, we do give it more credibility than it deserves. And every photograph is an oversimplification of something, right? That doesn't mean it's complete lie, but it is an oversimplification. Now, my problem with this point is not that I disagree with it. I do think One point I made about this essay is, a lot of times if you take my recordings and you clip it down to like 5 seconds, you might be able to make it sound like I say something really offensive at times, right? If you can find the right clip. Taken out of context, you could make it sound like I'm saying something offensive. And that's like a 5 second clip. So you can think of as a picture as like an instant clip, right? And so with the picture, you can make it seem like someone did something offensive or inappropriate or wrong if you get the right picture at the right time, right? If you get a picture of somebody when they don't know that you're taking a picture of them, you might be able to make it look like all kinds of embarrassing things. So I agree with her in this sense that photography is an oversimplification. My problem with this point is just that it's not just photography. And what I'm saying throughout this entire book, she makes points about photography, and I want to say it's not just photography, right? There's all kinds of things. Bring this into a broader context. The problem is not just photographs, right? And the same thing here with oversimplification. I think this is a really important point about our culture, about our society, that pictures oversimplify things, headlines on stories oversimplify things, short articles oversimplify things. And in general, it's not easy to find the truth. It's up to us to think critically and not let a photo manipulate us, not let a headline manipulate us, not let a short article manipulate us. Let's not turn ourselves always into the victim. We have some agency too. We can be critical thinkers. We can discuss these things with our friends or with people that we think are wise and intelligent, and try to get to a deeper understanding. Right. So, yeah, there's some responsibility when someone takes a photograph or writes a headline. Of course, they have the responsibility to tell an accurate story. They also have the responsibility to try to get it right as best they can. But when the placement of a photograph and the placement of a of a headline in a news story and things like this, that's very important. But any oversimplification, which means like just a headline and a picture, will always get it wrong in some way, no matter how true to what you're trying to say it is. It will always sort of get something wrong. And we always need to dig into the details to really get the true story. And most things in life are gray. They're rarely black and white answers. And so, I can't help but keep saying this. So to me, it's not about photography. Photography is just one piece of the puzzle. But the oversimplification of truth, the oversimplification of reality is just present throughout everything that we do and all throughout history, in my opinion. So it's that's what I think the essay, I can make an essay about oversimplification. That's what I would do. And photography would just be one example of so many different examples of how we oversimplify. She also talks about how we get desensitized to photos of disturbing things. And of course, this is something that's true. We understand that. The first or couple thing disturbing photos we might be really disturbed by and get really frustrated. But then the more disturbing photos we see, we might start to, become desensitized, and we have a harder time becoming, enraged by it. But this is not just true of photography. Again, I'm going to make this same point. I think this is a much deeper human truth that we become desensitized to things. I mean, think about the Colosseum in Rome. This was a great example. There were no photographs, but these people became desensitized to violence that was just, was really cruel, and all kinds of different ways that we've engaged in war over history. I think oftentimes the people that engaged in that became desensitized to that kind of war, hacking into human beings with swords and pouring, boiling oil on top of people out of a castle. Like there's all kinds of examples throughout history. I mean, World War One, World War Two. There's so many examples where we become desensitized to awful things, and it's photographs is a part of that story, no doubt about it. But there's something deeper about just humanity there that we. In general, become desensitized to things that we become used to, right? The more we get used to something, the less we get enraged by it. And I think that's a fundamental human truth. And that's something that we need to think about, to try to guard against that typical human behavior that we all have. But to make that about photographs on its own, to me, is just it's the pseudo intellectual points that I just don't think are good, worth really getting into. To give some idea of some other points that she makes, that again, each one can be like their own New York Times article. Maybe I've even read these articles before. Um, Photos get in the way of us just experiencing an event. Again, this is something that I think we talk about quite a bit at this point in society. Photography becomes the work one must do while on vacations. Photos give us an appearance of participation. These are some points that she's making. And don't get me wrong, these are facts that we know about, like society. Sometimes it feels like we're at the pub and we're just, we're having a beer and we're ranting about selfie sticks, and don't get me wrong, selfie sticks are worth ranting about. I think we've all had our little rants about them. What the heck's going on? Why are there so many selfie sticks everywhere? But it just doesn't feel like something you write into a book. It's something you rant about over a beer, and maybe you write a New York Times article, but I don't know. It's a rant at the end of the day, and there's not a ton of substance there. To photograph people is to violate them. To photograph someone is a sublimated murder, a soft murder, appropriate to a sad, frightened time. That's a very, it's a pretty sentence. But I just I feel like the words are way too strong for what she's trying to say here. It's pretty that you want to like shock me and be, I just don't understand where you're going with some of these things. Um, Photos shock insofar as they show something novel. Unfortunately, the ante keeps getting raised. That's something I talked about before. And then she talks about how time transfers most things into art. This is another interesting point where, when things get old, we think that they're beautiful, right? Just because they become old. Maybe someone took some random photo, but because it becomes old and maybe looks a little tinged on the outside, now we're like, wow, that's kind of pretty, And I don't think there's necessarily something wrong with that, but it is something worth observing that we do this. When something becomes old, it doesn't have to have the same quality that it had to have when it was new. It's just the fact that it's old. It's sort of interesting, right? And she ends the first essay by saying that everything exists to end in a photograph. It's a big sentence. I don't think that's true, but I do think that, we take a lot of photographs. And so it's worth thinking about what's the value of that, right? And, let me just say to end this discussion, Susan does make a lot of points here, as I said. And a lot of these points are worth thinking about. They're worth talking about with your friends and reflecting on. They're worth even writing essays about, where you flesh out the point and give me some good arguments. But ultimately, for me, most of these points are not very specific to photography, and rather they are broader points about humanity. And I would prefer to see the essay written with a broader view in mind. Connect things for me across, photographs, paintings, writings, experiences throughout history. Give me that sort of perspective. Tell me what to do about it. Tell me what we should be doing. What do you think is the final analysis here, or where should we go with this? The thing is that photographs aren't going away, right? We're not going to stop taking photographs. I mean, maybe with more and more artificial intelligence and large language models getting involved, it's going to change, and I can't predict for you how that's going to change, but I don't think that these sort of images are going away. So what do we do about it, right? How do we fully be human in the midst of this, and what does it look like going forward? Those are interesting things to me. I'd like to see people write about that. Um, so again, check out this first essay called "In Plato's Cave," and let me know if you completely disagree with me. Right? Some people are definitely going to like this and are going to disagree. I'm happy to have some productive disagreement. That's what this is all about. And so, yeah, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think, and I hope to see you at another discussion.